The end of our series on the American Mind of 1776. Hopefully we'll finish it this evening. And then next Sunday night, we begin a new study on the book of Deuteronomy. But let me recommend 3 books to you, because we're coming now to 1776, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the War of Independence, because most of the books that you're going to find on these subjects are revisionist history, that they have changed what really took place. And that's one of the reasons that we wanted to teach this series, is to help you know how Americans really did think. I told you when I was growing up, after I got in college and seminary, I was told that the Declaration of Independence was a humanistic, deistic document, and I just believed that until I started reading for myself what took place in 1776, the last of the 1700s. This one is called Defending the Declaration: How the Bible and Christianity Influenced the Writing of the Declaration of Independence, by Gary Amos, A-M-O-S, Defending the Declaration. Then this book is delightful. That's written by a friend of mine. This is written by a friend of mine, called Christianity and the Constitution. Christianity and the Constitution goes through and spells out the Christian faith. Some more better Christian than others, but spells out the Christian faith of the founding fathers of the United States. It's written by John Eidsmoe, E-I-D-S-M-O-E. And then one of the most respected scholars, conservative, generally Christian, in the late 20th century is a man called M.E. Bradford. Bradford was professor of English at the University of Dallas, Texas, and author of many books. And this book called A Worthy Company, Brief Lives of the Framers of the U.S. Constitution. All of these 3 will give you different insight, and I think a true insight, into how Americans thought that created this country and what they were really trying to do. If we were to distill what was unique about the American mind of 1776, that is the consensus of opinion in colonial America, we could distill it down to this one Bible verse, which they believed with all their hearts and sought to work out the implications of in every area of society, and that's Isaiah 33:22, which simply says, "The Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us." We come now to the last 2 roots. We've been looking at 14 roots of the American mind of 1776 that shaped the thinking of Americans, that enabled them to produce what they produced. We have 2 more to go, and one is one of my favorite men in history. It was a Scottish Presbyterian by the name of Samuel Rutherford. He died in 1661. And it was said about him that he was one of the most extraordinary men in an age of heroes. He was a leader in the Church of Scotland, a famous preacher, university professor, author, commissioner from Scotland to the Westminster Assembly in the 1640s. And he influenced the American mind largely through a book that he wrote called Lex Rex. Not Rex Lex, but Lex Rex. Lex means law, Rex means king. The law is king. Charles I would have written a book called Rex Lex. The king is law. But Samuel Rutherford's book is The Law is King, that said that king and everybody else is accountable to the law and is to be judged in terms of the law that's rooted in the law of God. Rutherford was suspected of treason by the Stuarts because he wrote this book. His book was later burned by the public hangman. Rutherford was found guilty of treason by the drunken parliament. They sent soldiers to his bedroom, his death bedroom, to bring him to trial. And when they came into his room to tell him that he was summoned to the court, he said, "Give His Majesty my regrets. I'm being hastened to a greater court than his own." And he died. This book, Lex Rex, was one of the bestsellers in 1776 in the American colonies. Not Thomas Paine, Common Sense, but the 2 great Calvinistic books, Vindicii Contra Tyrannus, The Vindication of Liberty Against Tyranny, written by the French Huguenot Duplessis Mornay, and this other book, Lex Rex, The Law is King, written by a Scottish Calvinist and Presbyterian. One of the reasons that the King of England hated this book and had the whole first edition, or most of the first edition, burned, there are very few copies that are left, and they're worth a fortune, is because Samuel Rutherford said, according to the Bible, if God's going to bless a nation, then kings must be elected by the people. And the Stuarts didn't take kindly to that. Let me give you 3 points very quickly because we're going to try to finish up this evening. 3 of the main points that Samuel Rutherford made in Lex Rex that had such an impact upon the way Christians thought in 1776. Number 1, only God can distinguish good from evil, and he has done so in the Bible. That if you leave it up to man to distinguish good from evil, he will call evil good and good evil. There will be arbitrarily defined terms. Number 2, only God can define criminal acts, and he has done so in the Bible. You leave it up to man to define what a crime is and what it is not, it becomes very unjust. Because in the eyes of many men, I could be arrested. Somebody could send lawyers after me, be on trial. I'm fixing to commit a crime right now. I'm going to tell you right here and now. I'm going to commit a crime in the eyes of some pieces of state legislature. Homosexuals are sexual perverts. Now that is a hate crime. I don't know how they can see my heart, but nevertheless, that is a hate crime. So whenever you leave it to man to define what's criminal, the crime becomes arbitrarily defined. Only God can define what's criminal and what's not, and he has done so in the Bible. You want to know what a crime is? Look in the Bible. God will tell you. Thirdly, only God can determine how crime is to be justly punished, and he has done so in the Bible. How do you determine how you punish various crimes? You just guess? You look at the most recent psychological survey or poll or research? No, God has defined how crime is to be punished in the Bible. So those are the great influences of Lex Rex on the American mind of 1776. I wish we had more time to go into it. Now, the 16th and last root that we're going to look at, I hate to tell you about. The previous 15 were good. This one's poisonous. We must go back to the era called the Enlightenment to understand fully the American mind of 1776. Now understand, in the light of everything we've said over the past several Sunday nights, the American mind of 1776 was predominantly, explicitly, self-consciously, and unashamedly Christian, although not perfectly so. That the 18th century in Europe, the late 1600s and the 1700s, has been called the Enlightenment. I prefer to call it the Endarkenment. The Enlightenment was that period when Europe increasingly rejected its Christian roots and its Christian traditions and its Christian foundations and replaced it with a foundation based upon man and the power of human reason unaided by divine revelation. The period of enlightenment ended in 1789 with the French Revolution, in one sense. The 2 main causes of the Enlightenment, when people started rejecting the Christian base and going to humanism as a base, the 2 main causes of the Enlightenment were these. 1, the maturing and increasing influence of the Renaissance with its faith that man is the measure of all things, through the writings of such men as Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Diderot, Descartes, Spinoza, Hobbes, Hume, John Locke, and many, many others. Now, what was the Renaissance? In the 5th century, Augustine dominated things that said you could only understand life in terms of the Word of God. 12th, 13th century, a new voice came with Aquinas. Said there's some things that you can understand with the Bible, there's other things you can understand without the Bible by the use of reason. The Renaissance came along and said, Aquinas, if you could understand some things without the Bible, you could understand anything without the Bible. And so the Renaissance went back over the head of Christendom to ancient Greek and Rome and sought to blend classical philosophy with the Christian faith, and eventually classical philosophy ate up the Christian faith, and all you were left with was humanism, rationalism, things like that. And the Reformation was a return to Augustine. The Renaissance and the Reformation were at war with each other because the Reformation said you can't understand life except by the Word of God. The Renaissance said you can't understand life except by human reason. And the church made a mistake in trying to get those 2 together. The Enlightenment is the natural maturation of the Renaissance. The second cause of the Enlightenment was the weakening of a new generation in those countries affected by the Reformation, which was taking for granted the battles and victories of the Protestant Reformation. Many began to apostatize from the faith of their fathers, asserting to one degree or another the autonomy, pretended independence from God of the human mind and the human will. So things start changing. Second, third, fourth, fifth generation Christians and Puritans and Calvinists started being allured into the Enlightenment with its praise for man and the exaltation of man. And so there was this slippage in Christian generations. The Enlightenment began to show itself in small but definite ways, like the camel sticking his nose in the tent. Eventually he comes in. The camel had stuck his nose in the tent in the late 1700s. And the Enlightenment, this idea that the mind, unaided by reason, can comprehend some aspects of life, began to make its way into the American mind of 1776. Our historical overview of the Christian roots of the American mind has led us to conclude that the colonial reasons behind the Declaration of Independence and the War for American Independence were self-consciously Christian reasons, and that war rested on a solidly legal and biblical basis. The American War of Independence, you remember, was not a revolution. It's a misnomer to call it a revolution. It was not an unconstitutional rebellion against legitimate authority. It was a war fought in order to preserve a Christian civilization. You see the roots we've been talking about now for weeks beginning to shape their actions. Ideas have consequences. And a war fought in defense of a life of free and local and self-government that was being invaded by the tyranny of the British king, who had broken his covenant with the colonies. The colonies, who saw themselves as 13 North American nations, republics, were by nature, history, and law Christian republics. I have a book in my office called A Republic of Republics, and that's how they saw themselves. Each Christian republic, each state had its own cherished legal, political, and social order based on distinctively and historically Christian principles. Rushdoony said each colony was thus an independent state with its own independent civil structure under a feudal lord, the King of England, represented in the colony by the royal governor. After the War for Independence was won, the United Colonies adopted the United States Constitution in order to preserve their strongly held biblical beliefs that civilization must be Christian and that civil government must be limited, constitutional, decentralized, and local if liberty and justice for all are to prevail. Rushdoony said the Constitution was designed to perpetuate a Christian order. Every constituent state had some form of Christian establishment or settlement which it jealously guarded. This was an area of states' rights, not of federal control. When interpreted according to the original intent of the authors, the First Amendment of the Constitution was meant to protect these Christian principles, heritage, and social order in these Christian states. The federal government had no intention to secularize itself. Furthermore, says Rushdoony, the rights of the constituent states to have their Christian order without interference was underscored by barring Congress, the first word in the First Amendment, by barring Congress, that is the federal government, from either establishing or prohibiting religion in the states. What the 13 Christian republics had fought to maintain against Crown and Parliament, they refused to surrender to a federal government. The freedom of the First Amendment from federal interference is not freedom from religion, but freedom for religion in the constituent states. The point is that the Declaration of Independence, the War for American Independence, and the U.S. Constitution are all rooted distinctively, though not without mixture. There was this Enlightenment strand that was starting to poison things. But it is distinctively rooted in biblical, historic, and Reformed Christianity, as we've shown. Although scholars and historians have argued otherwise, the distinctive features of all three can be accounted for only if interpreted in terms of their Christian roots. Now, we're going to say a lot of critical things about a man I'm going to mention now named John Locke that some Christians claim as a Christian influence on the United States. But nothing could be farther from the truth. John Locke lived from 1632 to 1704. And although John Locke began the secularization of a Christian and covenantal approach to politics with his social compact theory, and with that the beginning of the de-Christianization of human reason, teaching that human reason unaided by divine revelation could discover in the laws of nature the elements necessary for a just civil government. That's good Greek and Roman philosophy. Lousy Bible. Lousy Christianity. Nevertheless, Locke, born into a Puritan family and being an evangelical Christian himself, could not escape the influence of his heritage. Many of his doctrines were not completely new, but were a restating and redefining of ancient Christian doctrines so as to exclude in his philosophy the impact of man's depravity on his thinking and the necessity of presupposing the truth of God's word for knowledge and morality in politics. The thing to bear in mind about John Locke was he was an Arminian, not a deist. We don't have time to go in again to the difference between Arminianism and Calvinism, but historians have not done a good job at showing how the decline of Calvinism and the rise of Arminianism in the American pulpit led to the de-Christianization of the United States. And that the Unitarians and the deists and the rest stood on the shoulders of the Arminians to secularize the United States. You know, John Locke wrote a famous book called Two Treatises on Government in 1689, and in that book he justified the idea of a constitutional monarch. Here's where Arminianism paves the way for tyranny. He insisted, as a good Arminian, that goodness is the natural state of things, that men are basically good, not totally depraved. And of course, if they're basically good, you can trust them. And you can give them power, and you can give them tax money, and you can let them do what they want to, and then comes tyranny. Locke argued that all men are equal and independent by nature, not slaves to sin, as the Bible teaches. The state he held was the result of a mutual contract among men guided by their desire to safeguard their natural rights. Locke's political and philosophical theories became a foundational part of the general faith of the Enlightenment. This is what European Enlightenment people love to believe. Underlying his theories was the notion that no authority exists beyond human will and human reason. Gary Mose, in his book Streams of Civilization, says, in Locke's essay concerning human understanding, he held that the mind of man is at birth a blank tablet upon which knowledge is inscribed through experience. For this reason, Locke is known as the founder of British empiricism. From Locke's rationalistic religious views, it was only one short hop to the theology of the deists, that the only proofs of God's existence is in his works of nature. In other words, this man is saying that first came Arminianism, and then on the Arminianism came deism, and with that, the secularization of the United States. Authors have gone to the extreme in two directions in interpreting the events connected with 1776. Some have erred in thinking that the persons, events, and documents of America's founding were perfectly and completely Christian, totally immune from the influences of the Enlightenment. Others have erred in stating that the persons, events, and documents of America's foundings were in no way Christian, but were products of the European Enlightenment and deism. We have some Christians that profess to believe that. I have an article that we can send you if you want it called Natural Law or Biblical Law, where I point out the non-Christian strains of thought in the American mind of 1776, which have been proven fatal to liberty and justice for all men. But right now, I want us to make some comments about the other extreme, that the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were products of deism, and that the War of Independence was inspired by deism, not by Christianity. Among the new thinkers of the Enlightenment, who rejected the divine authority of the Bible for the independence of the human reason, were the deists, who were determined to create a religion and worldview based on reason rather than revelation. I'm saying deism, not theism. There's a world difference between the two. Theism means the study of God. Deism, D-E-I-S-M, is this rationalistic theology that began to make its way in America in the very, very late 1700s. Deism was European born in the late 1600s, was popular in Europe in the 1700s and on into the early 1800s. A man by the name of Lord Edward Herbert, who died in 1648, wrote the first book on deism. Gary Mose says he opposed special revelation, saying it corrupted natural religion by introducing superstition. In Herbert's view, all religions have 5 ideas in common. 1, the existence of a supreme being. 2, the need to worship a supreme being. 3, the importance of virtue and piety for worship. 4, the necessity for repentance. And 5th, the future life of rewards and punishments. It was a pretty boring religion, so it eventually was transformed by Romanticism, Transcendentalism, and the like. John Eidsmoe has pointed out that deism contradicts Orthodox Christianity by denying any direct intervention in the natural order by God. No use in praying. He's not going to intervene. God's the big clockmaker. He made the universe like a big clock, instilled certain laws in it to govern it on its own. Then he stepped out of the picture after winding up the clock of creation to let the creation wind down by itself. And he never intervenes. There is no revelation. There is no providence. Now, the colonists were familiar with the tenets of deism. Deism did not gain a strong foothold in America by 1776 or 1789. There was hardly any deists in America when the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were written. My friends Greg Singer and Gary North notwithstanding. In many states, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, confessed deists were not allowed to hold public office. That tells you what they think about deism. Actually, says one writer, deism was a late arrival in America and very slight in extent and influence prior to the American Revolution. Those early Americans that are frequently identified as deists, for example, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, may not have been Christians personally. They were most certainly infected by the rationalism of the Enlightenment, but they were not deists. At the Constitutional Convention, Franklin called for prayer, declaring that God governs in the affairs of men. That's a quote. Deists would never say such a thing. But according to deism, God could not so intervene, making prayer useless. Franklin also loved to hear the evangelistic and Calvinistic preaching of George Whitefield. And Thomas Jefferson may not have been an Orthodox Christian, but neither was he an Orthodox deist. His beliefs regarding the Republican nature of civil government, the nature of man, the federal nature of politics, the rule of constitutional law originating in common law with its roots in Anglo-Saxon law and Mosaic law, revealed that he could not completely escape his Christian upbringing and the American consensus of opinion of his day, no matter how hard he may have tried. Consider these quotations from Franklin and Jefferson. The first two are by Benjamin Franklin, made in the Constitutional Convention, June the 28th, 1787. They're on the bottom of page 41 in your papers. This is Benjamin Franklin. See if it sounds like a deist to you. In this situation of this assembly, the Constitutional Convention, groping as it were in the dark to find the political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible to danger, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard. They were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future natural felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sire, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable an empire can rise without his aid? We've been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, They labor in vain that built it. Benjamin Franklin. Sound like a deist to you? Now here's Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "Can the liberties of a nation be sure when we remove their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that a change of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference." Sound like a deist to you? Rushton points out that with reference to these quotes by Franklin and Jefferson, here in clear and forthright language from these men is Calvinism's predestination and total providence, and at the same time, the near Unitarian exclusion of Christ from the Godhead. God is not seen as an absentee landlord, and not only reason, but also more than reason is appealed to. And he says that in these quotes, you have definite Christian influences, but with mixed linguistic, religious, and philosophical premises. That as great as they were, you still begin to see the beginnings of rationalism, but no deism. How then do we explain the prevalent reference to the writings and teachings of the European deists and Unitarians and men of the Enlightenment by the Americans of 1776 with deep Christian roots? Now, that's been the stumbling block for a lot of people to believe that we are founded as a Christian nation. If these founders were Christians, why did they quote the bad guys so often? Why did they quote the deists and Unitarians and all the rest if they didn't believe the men that they quoted? Well, let's answer that question. There's a good answer to it. When the people of 1776 used the terms of the deists and others, they always gave them an American twist. In other words, just as the words republic, law, and liberty are used today both by Marxists and Christians, we have far different meaning in those words than does the Marxists. So the colonial Americans used the political language familiar with Europeans to communicate to them effectively their justification for the war for independence from the King of England. In other words, understand the purpose of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. It was to use the popular language of the day that Europeans would understand without selling out their own principles, using the language the Europeans would understand to convince the Europeans that what we're doing over here in North America is just and legal. So that the U.S. Declaration of Independence, it was honest propaganda. It was to convince Europe that we're doing the right thing. Europe was so far gone in the Enlightenment that they couldn't quote biblical things. So they quoted the people that the Europeans were reading wherever they could find a phrase or a word that they could take out of that foreign system and give it a different twist to the Europeans could understand. However, when the colonial Americans used words like social contract, laws of nature and nature's God, the consent of the governed, all men are created equal, and the like, most of those taken from the Declaration of Independence, they meant something different by those terms from what the deists and rationalists meant in Europe. We've tried to show that over the past several weeks. Furthermore, many of these terms or the ideas behind them did not originate with the deists. Rather, they had a long and respected history in Christian terminology for hundreds of years, as we've shown. The deists took them from the Christians, not vice versa. However, when the deists took them from the Christians, they de-Christianized those terms. And when the Christians took them back, they attempted to re-Christianize them and to use them in a way that is reflective of their Christian roots. Although they were not always consistent, and that's why they use those words and how they use those words. In 1825, aged Thomas Jefferson explained his mindset when he assisted in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. He said these words, but let me stop and say, remember when we were taught in public schools that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence? It isn't true. Thomas Jefferson was not the sole author of the Declaration. There were 4 other men on the committee that was assigned the responsibility to draft the Declaration: John Adams, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Another 50 men spent July the 2nd revising the document the committee presented. And that committee made at least 30 changes. Then Congress made another 55 alterations, including the removal of 480 words. The myth that Jefferson is the sole author of the Declaration of Independence stemmed primarily from his presidential campaigns against John Adams. But here's what Thomas Jefferson said with reference to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Neither aiming at originality of principles or sentiments, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind. We wanted not only to communicate in words and ideas that were popular in Europe, we wanted the Declaration of Independence to be reflective of the way Americans thought, which was distinctively Christian. He used language familiar not only to his fellow rationalists, but also to the Christian populace, which language had a place in their long medieval Reformation, Puritan, and Covenanter heritage. Gary North said the radicals of later generations could pick up certain phrases used by Jefferson, but only by reading into those terms ideas that would have been foreign to the majority of the members of the Continental Congress and probably foreign to Jefferson himself. Now that's important. Looking back, should they have used those phrases that they used? Well, these are smarter men than I am, but we could question that. But what modern scholars do is they look back now, and in those words and ideas and phrases that they got from the deists and the humanists, they read back scholars as if the whole system is to be found in those words and phrases, and that these early Americans were, in fact, deists and Unitarians alike. And that is an unjust way of treating the framers of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. These men were not radicals. They were not humanists consistently at all. They were Christians with flaws in their thinking. Don't forget that the men who participated in the Continental Congress and the Declaration were the same men who drafted the conservative Christian state constitutions in the 13 colonies, establishing Christianity in those colonies. I want to look at some phrases in the Declaration of Independence. I trust you'll remember these phrases, because these are the phrases that are used to prove that the Declaration is a deist, a humanistic document. And I want to show you that these are phrases that came out of a Christian heritage, that were used with a Christian, though flawed, context. For instance, the Declaration of Independence speaks of the laws of nature and of nature's God. This phrase reflects an ancient and traditional perspective in Christendom, whether Roman Catholic or Protestant, that God's law should govern all human actions and thought, and that law is to be found in nature and in the Bible. Now let's stop here before we go on. The influence of classical thought on the mind of 1776 eventually was devastating, and it destroyed America. And one of the most important ways the classical thought destroyed mind in 1776 was its understanding of the laws of nature. All Roman Catholics and Protestants believed there were such things, that there were laws in nature from which, if you properly observed them and used your mind correctly, you could determine a whole system of theology and ethics without reference to God or the Bible. And so this concept of natural law, which is as unbiblical as it can be, was brought into Christianity, so that you had two sources of law. You had natural law and you had biblical law. And the Christians tried to keep them together. And they tried to show that you can only see the laws of nature through biblical law. But they were trying to blend two things that were diametrically opposed to each other. The very idea that there are laws in nature from which we can deduce ethical principles by proper observation and the use of the mind, unaided by revelation, has all kinds of false presuppositions. It presupposes that the mind, unaided by revelation, wants to find laws from God to obey, whereas the unregenerate mind is in rebellion against God. There's nothing objective about it. So when you see this blending of Greek and Roman thought on one hand, Christian thought on the other, in the phrase in the Constitution, the laws of nature and of nature's God. That was found in Christian literature long before it was found in European Enlightenment literature. Those phrases, the laws of nature, refer to laws ostensibly found in nature, and the laws of nature's God was a common way of referring to biblical law in those days. So here you have a reference to biblical law right in the Declaration of Independence in language not that we use, but which they used. The laws of nature and the laws of nature's God to be found in the Bible. And then there's the phrase self-evident truths. With reference to this phrase, the Declaration of Independence, said one person, challenged a growing body of skeptical relativism in Europe. Hume, Montesquieu, and other scholars had abandoned any belief in self-evident truths. In other words, Christians believe there are some truths from God that are so self-evident that there's no use to try to prove them. Everybody knows them, and if they don't admit to it, they're suppressing the truth. But this form of relativism, which says there's no such thing as self-evident truths, was almost entirely absent in the colonies. Thus, Jefferson inserted the phrase dealing with self-evident truths after his original phrase, sacred and undeniable. Now, those words were edited out, but what Jefferson wanted to say was there's some truths that are sacred and undeniable and self-evident. But they were scratched out of his manuscript, apparently by Benjamin Franklin. Yet in terms of the American outlook, sacred and undeniable was a phrase far closer to American religious feeling in the 18th century. And it was Jefferson the one to put it there. When they spoke of self-evident truths, they were reflecting their understanding of Romans 1:18, which says that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they're without excuse. I'm showing you that this language has a long Christian pedigree before it was in the mouths of the deists. And then in the Declaration, there is the phrase unalienable rights. This phrase was based on the existence of a sovereign God whose decree established rights. Gary North said, without God, the state or history or the proletariat party of the future or some other human institution becomes the source of human rights. But the idea of a God-sustained system of rights was absolutely basic to 18th century constitutional thought. If God is sovereign, then the state cannot be totally sovereign. It can only be derivatively sovereign, the state under God's law. What God has granted, the state may not legitimately remove. Inalienable human rights are not, said the Declaration, granted by England, but by God. Remove men's faith in a creator, however, and the idea cannot stand. You see the Christian roots of the phrase unalienable rights. And then the phrase in the Constitution, all men are created equal. John Locke and the rationalists meant by equality that, says Gary North, in the absence of corrupting human institutions, all men innately are equal. So everybody's basically good, equally good, and it's bad institutions that corrupt human beings. That's good, primeval environmentalism. Jefferson meant exactly the opposite of what Calvinist opinion meant by it. That is Locke. That in the absence of God's grace and godly human institutions, all men will act alike because all of them are totally depraved in the sight of God. So what Calvinism taught and Locke taught, two entirely different things. For nearly all members of Congress, it meant simply equality before the law and equality of opportunity. Gary North. So what is this all men equal? Not that everybody has equal gifts and equal talents and deserve equal rewards, but our founding fathers, based upon an ancient Christian heritage that goes all the way back to the book of Job, according to Robert L. Dabney, is that all men are equal before the law. Doesn't matter whether you're a king or whether you're a slave. You are accountable to God's law, and you should be judged by that law when you break it. And then there is the phrase in the Declaration of Independence, the consent of the governed. That was not only at the heart of a social contract theory of government by John Locke and others, it also reflects the teaching of the Bible that in church and state, the people have the responsibility to elect their leaders. You remember why Samuel Rutherford's book, Lex Rex, was burned? Because, he said, if God's going to bless England, then the kings of England must be elected by the people. Christendom had for centuries understood that says north, to preserve certain fundamental laws and fundamental human rights, rights given men by God, governments are instituted by men. The government derives its power from men who in turn derive their authority from God. The state is established by God following the traditional political theory of the Middle Ages, which in turn was built on Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 13. According to the compact theory, men acting together under God establish the civil power. And so you see, here's the roots that we've been talking about, showing themselves that people have a right before God to elect their own leaders. Listen to Rushdoony. He says a confusion in language and communication reflects usually a cultural confusion, but not necessarily a personal confusion. Many a man uses a language implying an alien faith without an awareness of the divergence of meaning. A major instance of this is the usage of such terms as reason, natural law, social contract, and related ones in the 17th and 18th centuries. A contemporary historian has remarked on the coincidence of language and divergence of meaning among various parties in France before and during the Revolution. This was no less true of colonial America. The refusal to recognize the divergence of meaning is behind the common ascription of deism to many 18th century Americans. On page 49, what he's saying is that when we read these words and ideas that appear to come from deism, understand the Americans always sought to redefine them. Not perfectly, but sought to redefine them. So you have this common language with diverse meanings, and that's important to understanding the Constitution and the Declaration the way it was. Page 49, the last two paragraphs. Enlightenment writings were known to Americans. In arguing their cases for independence, American thinkers freely resorted to the thinkers who carried weight with Europeans. But this did not mean an acceptance of their framework. American thinking was still essentially Christian, and its context was more theocentric than humanistic. The American context was theological, and the change was not from Puritanism to the Enlightenment, but rather from a theocratic Puritanism that wanted to build a Christian culture based upon the law of God and the gospel of God. Now, this is important. Here you see the way that it declined. It didn't decline overnight. All of a sudden, everybody was wonderful Puritans. The next day, everybody was terrible deists. First, you had the theocratic Puritans. That's us. You had the people who believed that every individual and all institutions were accountable to God, and they sought to build in North America a Puritan, Calvinistic, Christian civilization where every aspect of it was based on the entirety of the law and gospel in all its institutions. That early theocratic Puritanism of the Pilgrims, Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, people like Cotton Mather and the like, eventually was downgraded to a theological Puritanism, where the emphasis was not on a theocratic reconstructing of life and society, but on a person's relationship with God and precision in theology. And that's what you see in Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is a step away down from the original theocratic Puritanism of the founders. So you have a theocratic Puritanism that wanted all areas of life to be under the law of God. As time passed, you had that particular vision lost, and Calvinism, Puritanism became more basically a theological defining process. And then from that, you have the growing infiltration of New England Puritanism by Arminianism. That is from a God-centered to a man-centered understanding of life, where the important thing is not what God decides, but what man decides. And then the next step after Arminianism, with its emphasis on man's decision, came humanism, Unitarianism, deism, with its emphasis entirely on man and not on Christianity. The Enlightenment was in its essence anti-Christian and anti-church. Arminianism is a theological movement within the church, which manifests itself in everyday life as an emphasis on man's experience as against God's sovereignty. In other words, we live in an Arminian culture. So expect the next thing to come. It's already here. Humanistic philosophy, and with that, tyranny. Be sure to read these things that I have not been able to read, because you learn a great deal not only about our nation, the mistakes they made, but how we got to where we are. Now, I'm going to try to read a poem. If I can't get through it, I'll quit. In this poem, written by Thomas Buchanan Reed, you can see illustrated the influence of Christianity on the views of liberty of the colonial Americans and on their war for independence. Now, if I have to quit, you just keep reading. The Rising in 1776. Out of the north the wild news came, far flashing on its wings of flame, swift as the boreal light which flies at midnight through the startled skies. And there was tumult in the air, the fife's shrill note, the drum's loud beat, and through the wide land everywhere the answering tread of hurrying feet, while the first oath of freedom's gun came on the blast from Lexington, and Concord, roused no longer tame, forgot her old baptismal name, made bare her patriot arm of power, and swelled the discord of the hour. Within its shade of elm and oak, the church of Berkeley Manor stood. There Sunday found the rural folk, and some esteemed of gentle blood. In vain their feet, with loitering tread, passed mid the graves where rank is naught. All could not read the lesson taught in that republic of the dead. How sweet the hour of Sabbath talk, the vale with peace and sunshine full, where all the happy people walk, decked in their homespun flaxen wool. Where youth's gay hats with blossoms bloom, and every maid with simple art wears on her breast, like her own heart, a bud whose depths are all perfume, while every garment's gentle stir is breathing rose and lavender. The pastor came, his snowy locks hallowed his brow of thought and care, and calmly, as shepherds lead their flock, he led into the house of prayer. The pastor rose, the prayer was strong, the psalm was warrior David's song. The text, a few short words of might, the Lord of hosts shall arm the right. He spoke of wrongs too long endured, of sacred rights to be secured. Then from his patriot tongue of flame, the startling words for freedom came. The stirring sentences he spake compelled the heart to glow or quake, and rising on his theme's broad wing, and grasping in his nervous hand the imaginary battle brand, in face of death he dared to fling defiance to a tyrant king. Even as he spoke, his frame, renewed in eloquence of attitude, rose, as it seemed, a shoulder higher, then swept his kindling glance of fire from startled pew to breathless choir, when suddenly his mantle wide, his hands impatient flung aside, and lo, he met their wondering eyes, complete in all a warrior's guise. A moment, there was awful pause, when Berkeley cried, "Cease, traitors, cease! God's temple is the house of peace." The others shouted, "Nay, not so, when God is with our righteous cause. His holiest places that are ours, his temples are our forts and towers that frown upon the tyrant foe. In this, the dawn of freedom's day, there is a time to fight and pray." And now before the open door, the warrior priest had ordered so, the enlisting trumpet's sudden roar rang through the chapel o'er and o'er, its long reverberating blow. So loud and clear it seemed the ear of dusty death must wake and hear. And there the startling drum and fife fired the living with fiercer life, while overhead, with wild increase, forgetting its ancient toll of peace, the great bell swung as ne'er before. It seemed as it would never cease, and every word its ardor flung from off its jubilant iron tongue was war, war, war. Who dares? This was the patriot's cry, as striding from the desk, the pulpit, the preacher came. Come out with me in freedom's name, for her to live, for her to die. 100 hands flung up reply. 100 voices answered, aye. Let's pray. Father, we pray that you would make of us men and women as those men and women. For Christ's sake, amen.